Welcome to Central Speaks, home of our weekly podcast. Central Speaks is produced by Hamilton Central Baptist Church.
In many spheres of life, it's become fashionable to have a mentor. And our mentor is typically someone that we look up to and we often want to emulate. That there might be someone with more experience than we have and whose track record or history motivates us. Their character, their style influences how we approach certain tasks or situations. And we find ourselves, asking the question, what would he or she do in this situation? Well, as well as mentors that we can meet with face-to-face, it's also possible to have passive mentors whom we may never meet personally, but whose writing or whose character exerts influence over us. A passive mentor can even be someone who lived in a different era of history, but the record of their life inspires us or shapes our thinking. Well, one of the more influential passive mentors for me is a man that we actually met last Sunday. His parents named him Joseph, and he grew up on the Mediterranean island of Cyprus. He was from a staunch Jewish family, but he had an open mind to new things that God was doing. Well, history doesn't actually remember Joseph by the name his parents gave him. We know him by a nickname that the apostles gave him, Barnabas. Last Sunday, we looked at how the early Christian movement began to reach non-Jews. In Antioch, in Acts chapter 11, a bunch of Gentiles became Christ followers, which was a concern to the Christian leaders in Jerusalem. And would these non-Jews know the rules and how to behave and how to do things properly? So they sent one of their number to Antioch to check them out, and they sent Barnabas, a Levite, and when he got there and saw evidence of the grace of God in their midst, he was glad and he encouraged them. Luke mentions a little comment about his reputation in Acts chapter 11, verse 24. He was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and faith, and a great number of people were brought to the Lord. But there's a whole lot more to the story of Barnabas than just what happened in Antioch. And the more I read about him, the more I find myself wanting to be like him. The first reference we get to him is in Acts chapter 4, where Luke had been describing how people with excess property were selling land and bringing them money and laying it at the feet of the apostles for distribution amongst the poor. And Luke gives one example. Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, sold a field he owned, and he brought the money and he put it at the apostles' feet. The term Barnabas was actually derived from two words or phrases. Bar was a bit like a personal pronoun meaning son of, and Nabas referred to prophetic exhortation that encouraged or built people up. So Barnabas literally meant son of encouragement. Encouragement was what he's remembered for. That was the reputation that he had. That was what sprang to mind when people heard his name. And to call someone the son of something in Jewish culture was a way of describing their character, as if they were the offspring or the outcome of a particular behavior. So when people referred to him as Barnabas or son of encouragement, it was a way of capturing his personality or reputation. I've been pondering this idea of reputation during the week and just wondering how people might think of me or of you when our time on this mortal coil is over. What might our lingering reputation be? It's actually quite a sobering thought. Well, it doesn't happen so much these days, but in days past, people would record the character, the memory of a person in an epitaph that they put on their gravestone. A few carefully selected words that summed up the impact a person had upon the world. And again, makes you wonder what they might put on our epitaph as a way of capturing our reputation. You might know that on the grave of Spike Mulligan in East Sussex are the words in Gaelic, "I told you I was sick." Or in a Ribblesford, England cemetery, there's a tomb to a person called Anna Wallace, whose inscription we probably don't want on ours. The children of Israel wanted bread and the Lord sent them manna. Old Clark Wallace wanted a wife and the devil sent him Anna. In Uniontown, Pennsylvania, there's a cemetery where you can read these words: "Here lies the body of Jonathan Blake, stepped on the gas instead of the brake." Or a widow wrote this epitaph in a Vermont cemetery as a kind of advertisement: "Sacred to the memory of my husband John Barnes, who died January 3, 1803. His comely young widow, aged 23, has many qualifications of a good wife and yearns to be comforted." Or a lawyer's epitaph in England reads, "Sir John Strange. Here lies an honest lawyer, and that is strange." Someone in Winslow, Maine didn't like a certain Mr. Wood. In memory of Beezer Wood, departed this life November 2nd, 1837, aged 45 years. Here lies one wood, enclosed in wood, one wood within another. The outer wood is very good, we cannot praise the other. Or Harry Edsel Smith of Albany, New York, born 1903, died 1942. Looked up the elevator shaft to see if the car was on the way down. It was. And in a Vermont, Maryland cemetery, here lies an atheist, all dressed up and no place to go. Well, coming back to Barnabas, what are some of the reasons why he acquired his reputation as a son of encouragement? There's actually a classic example in Acts chapter 9 that, well, it's often overlooked when people read the story of Saul's conversion. Saul had begun to mercilessly persecute followers of Jesus, and there was huge fear amongst the early Christians about what he might do to them. Well, then the most amazing thing happened, right? En route to the city of Damascus to arrest believers and drag them back to Jerusalem, Saul had a personal encounter with the Lord, blinded by a bright light, and as a result, he himself became a follower of Jesus. The fierce persecutor of Christians all of a sudden became one of the people he'd been trying to hunt down. Well, 2,000 years on, this all reads marvelous and amazing. But it's not hard to imagine how the early Christians would have been a little bit suspicious about the veracity of Saul's conversion experience. I mean, was it really genuine? Or was this just a ruse so that he could get access to the inside of the church? Maybe get his hands on a copy of the church's telephone directory. I mean, imagine how we might respond if someone who was mercilessly persecuting us all of a sudden wanted to join our community. Or, how would you respond to an obnoxious neighbour who was attempting to sue you over a boundary dispute and then all of a sudden invites you for dinner one Saturday night? You'd be really cautious. Well, that's exactly what happened to Saul. Acts chapter 9, verse 26. When he came to Jerusalem, that's Saul, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he really was a disciple. Well, however, there was apparently one person in the Jerusalem church who saw beyond fear and skepticism. Verse 27. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles. He told them how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord and that the Lord had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. So Saul stayed with them and moved about freely in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. Now, it's quite possible, actually, that Barnabas and Saul knew each other from way back. Barnabas, though, was an independent thinker who didn't conform to the usual prejudices or fears of the crowd. Regardless of what he had done, Barnabas saw in Saul the grace of God at work. Well, we might want to say that Barnabas's view of God was big enough to be able to save or turn around the vilest of sinners, and he was willing to give Saul a second chance. Well, I guess that raises the question, how big or powerful is our view of God or the power of his good news in our day and age? How might we respond if someone like a convicted murderer or a terrorist or some other heinous offender were to turn up at church declaring that they had come to know Jesus? Would they find acceptance and love, or would they be held at arm's length? In the case of Saul, we would have to say that because of Barnabas, Saul actually became accepted in the church. He encouraged Saul, by seemingly going out of his way to help him get across the doorstep of the church for the first time. He saw something new and possible for Saul, and he took the risk of giving him a go when others didn't want to accept him or wanted to write him off. Now, surely that is a great reputation to have. Perhaps another aspect of Barnabas' encouraging reputation comes through in how he mentored the newly converted Saul in the early days of his ministry. We remember Saul as the great Apostle Paul, who wrote large chunks of our New Testament and helped shape the church. But in the initial days after his conversion, he himself needed a lot of help. Straight after the reference to Barnabas' visit to Antioch and his accreditation of these new Gentile converts, Luke tells us what he did next. Verse 25 of Acts 11. Then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul. And when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. And so for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. The disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. So after Saul's conversion and acceptance amongst the community of believers, he went back to Tarsus, where he had grown up. And Tarsus is relatively close to Antioch, and obviously the thought occurred to Barnabas that Saul might be able to help develop this new church community, and the clear implication is that Barnabas was the older or more experienced of the two, and that he mentored Saul in the early days of his ministry. He had an eye for who else he could involve in this new work, and he gave him the chance to try out and experiment with his first steps in ministry. Now, that's the reputation of an encourager. They don't hog the limelight for themselves. They provide opportunity for others to grow and to mature. Well, coming forward a couple of chapters, the ministry coupling of Barnabas and Saul was obviously recognized, and in the midst of what reads a bit like a leadership prayer meeting, there was a prophetic leading. This is Acts 13, starting at verse 2. While they were worshipping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." So after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. So together, Barnabas and Saul travelled and shared the good news. Barnabas was the older or more experienced of the two, and Saul was seemingly the apprentice or number two on the team. When you read the references in Acts, the initial listing is always Barnabas and Saul, or Paul. The leader of the team was mentioned first. But then as you track through the references to them, you notice that the order of their listing has swapped around. It becomes Paul and Barnabas, Paul and Barnabas. And the implication is that Paul's ministry and influence on the emerging Christian movement was increasing. Barnabas saw this, and it looks like Barnabas had the integrity and the self-security to recognize this development and to encourage it. He stopped claiming the first billing or the leadership role. He stepped aside to allow the apprentice to take the lead. Barnabas' reputation was more tied to the mission of God than to his own kudos or recognition. He encouraged the rising star by stepping aside and allowing his mentee to ascend and lead. Now that is a reputation to aspire to. We think less about ourselves and more about the development of others. I actually had an experience along these lines back in the mid-1980s. I'd been doing theological study for some time, part-time, and was invited to become the associate pastor of the Baptist church in Pukekohe. David Jacobson, some of you may know that name, was the senior pastor and someone that I held in huge admiration. David had been a very successful pastor and an evangelist for, several decades, and he was approaching retirement. I had a couple of years of part-time study still to do, and David suggested that we work together in a kind of a planned process of succession. Over 2 years, he would slowly ease out and retire, and over those same 2 years, I would finish my studies and ease in. It was a great plan, but it only lasted 20 minutes. On my first day on the job, 1st of March 1984, at 9:20 a.m, David had a heart attack. My first pastoral responsibility was taking the pastor's wife up to the hospital after the ambulance. So David had bypass surgery as a result and was off work for 3 months. The church had just appointed a new group of elders, and we were kind of thrown together, and we muddled our way through, and actually the church did remarkably well. In fact, so much so, when David came back to work, he looked at how things were going, and he made a radical suggestion. He suggested that we swap roles. He, the long experienced and effective pastor evangelist, nearing retirement, would become the associate pastor, and I, the young 25-year-old theological college student, could be the senior pastor. And for the next year, until his retirement, Barnabas, as it were, made way for a brash young Saul to assume the lead and learn the rudiments of pastoral ministry. Now that's a memorable reputation to aspire to. But then there's another development in this story that makes me want to be like Barnabas all the more. Paul and Barnabas were a formidable missionary team, and they worked well together. They involved others in their ministry as well, and they travelled around in an entourage. But then they hit a snag. One of the team members apparently got scared and ran away. Verse 36 of Acts chapter 15. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the brothers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them. But Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. So John Mark's really quite an interesting character in the early days of the church. We know that he and Barnabas were actually cousins. It says that in Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. And it's generally regarded that Mark was a young man during the ministry of Jesus. Well, we know him today as the author of the second gospel in the New Testament, which chronologically was probably the first to be written and published. However, he also made a serious mistake. As part of Paul and Barnabas' ministry team sometime before, he had run out on them, and when the going got tough, he got going. As far as Paul was concerned, Mark had blown it. He had let them down. He was no longer credible to be a servant of the Lord. He simply couldn't be trusted. But Barnabas saw something different in Mark that Paul couldn't see. Yes, he'd failed. He'd really let them down, and no doubt Paul had some justification at being angry with him. However, Barnabas also saw potential for good. Barnabas seemingly saw beyond failure or mistakes to future and restoration. Barnabas was willing to give him another go. Well, as we've noted, the conflict between Paul and Barnabas was so severe over this issue, they ended up parting company. In fact, there's no record of the New Testament of Barnabas and Paul working together after this all occurred. Well, it raises an interesting question. Who had the right perspective? I mean, if this was an employment dispute, who was right? And was it Barnabas, for whom we might say blood was thicker than water? Or what was it Paul who held the bar appropriately high? Well, from the record of the New Testament, I actually think we know the answer. Because in the end, you would have to say it was Barnabas, not Paul, who was right. You see, at some point further on in Paul's ministry, he must have come to that conclusion himself because, Mark appears again in Paul's letters as one of his trusted companions. It was sometime after this event, obviously, when Paul wanted to fire him, that Mark wrote his biography on the life of Jesus. Then in Paul's letters to the Colossians and in 2 Timothy and Philemon, he describes Mark as part of his ministry team and a faithful, helpful servant of the Lord. Mark was completely restored. In other words, Barnabas gave a failure a second chance, and Mark went on to be a powerful servant of the Lord. Well, that's a mentor that I want to follow and emulate. The God of our gospel is the God of second chances. And, well, I'm so glad that that's the case, because I know I need a lot of them. But so too do those I serve with or lead. We serve the God who restores broken failures and rebuilds those who have messed up. And surely he calls us to do a similar kind of godly work. Barnabas, for me, exemplifies this kind of character and motivates me to copy it in the reputation that I'm building. Well, sadly, the Christian army does have this reputation for shooting its wounded. You know, when a brother or a sister falls or fails, we can be renowned for coming down on them with a ton of recriminating bricks. We judge and condemn those who've been less than perfect. We conveniently forget and overlook our own imperfections and failures, which perhaps is why Jesus warned us to not judge others, lest we find ourselves judged. Well, in closing, a few thoughts about this whole idea of a good reputation. How important is that? I mean, people apparently thought very highly of Barnabas, but, well, is that really necessary for all of us? I mean, there's obviously a school of thought that suggests that reputation isn't very important at all. There's the attitude that says, I don't care what other people think of me. They can take me as they find me or not if they want, and if they don't like what they see or get, then, well, that's their problem. I don't care what other people think. At the other end of the spectrum, those perhaps who probably think too much about what others think about them. They're very intense and insecure people who imagine that every eye on a crowded street is on them as they walk down the footpath, and every ounce of excess fat has been noted and tabulated in some kind of imaginary scorecard. So, which of these two extremes is the right one? How much should we consider what others think about us? Well, in actual fact, the Bible has quite a bit to say about reputation. What other people think of us is not something that we should treat lightly or flippantly. Being people of good repute is something we're supposed to aim at and to not disregard. For instance, in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 3 and 4, it suggests that winning a positive image is something to aim for. Let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck, write them on the tablet of your heart, then you will win favor and a good name in the sight of God and of man. Or take Proverbs 25, 9 and 10. It warns us about maintaining our integrity when keeping a confidence. If you argue your case with a neighbor, do not betray another man's confidence, or he who hears it may shame you, and you will never lose your bad reputation. When Paul wrote to Timothy about the character of those who should be appointed to leadership positions in the church, one of the specific criteria was a good reputation with people outside of the church. He said that they should have a good reputation with outsiders so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. In other words, to use contemporary HR lingo, part of our due diligence on leaders calls for a bit of reference checking. This might appear a little bit counterintuitive at first, but maybe the people best able to authenticate the God-likeness of our character are those who are outside the church. What kind of reputation do we have amongst unbelievers? Or more importantly, what do they think about God because of what they see of him in us? It was Jesus who said, in Matthew chapter 5 verse 16, "In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven." I mean, that was actually a theme that the Apostle Peter picked up on in the first of his pastoral letters. He acknowledged that we have a responsibility to guard how we come across. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12, it says, "Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that he visits us." So why is our reputation important? Well, it's important because when we become a child of God, our personality, our character, become melded or intertwined with God's. And people will often judge what God is like by what they see of him in us. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20, Paul likened being a Christian to the role of an ambassador. We are ambassadors for Christ. Therefore, diplomats watch their own behavior and character very carefully, because everything they do is regarded as a reflection of their home country's government. So we all have our heroes in the Bible and throughout church history. That there are lots of people whose character and exploits, they inspire us and they influence us. Well, for me, one of the more significant is this man, Joseph, whom the apostles called Barnabas. And I commend him to us as a credible, passive mentor.
Thanks for joining us this week online. Come join us on Sunday mornings too if you're in Hamilton. Find out more about Hamilton Central Baptist Church and discover ways to get involved at www.hcbc.nz. Join us again next week at Central Speaks.